kind of beginning for a legendary hero.
Does it come in black?
He fights for family and lives for love.
Batman Begins occupies an interesting place in superhero movie history. By this point, the X-Men were on their way out, for now, and the MCU is only 3 years away from taking the world by storm. With Mr. Wayne himself, it's been about 8 years since he graced the big screen, and
It should have been you! It's your fault! If you had told Scoopers you weren't...
it was about time for a comeback. Here to save the day was an up-and-coming Christopher Nolan. With his trusty IMAX cam in hand, he had a singular goal: return the Dark Knight to his roots with a more grounded interpretation of the world's greatest detective. So, after more than a decade of superhero films, and not one, but 2 Batman later, does Nolan's first crack at the Caped Crusader hold up? Well, you saw the title of the video.
Well, I don't know what I expected.
Like many people, Batman is up there as one of my favorite superheroes, beaten only by his best friend and son in my personal favorites. While I like Batman, this review retrospective won't be all sunshine and roses. Batman Begins has its fair share of weird stuff. Most of it is harmless fun you can laugh at and move on. Other parts, however, are a little harder to ignore. But there's still a lot this movie did well. After all, it inspired an entire era of dark, grounded superhero movies, for better and for worse. While I'll be focusing on the first of the Nolan trilogy, the others will get referenced here and there as well, so consider this your spoiler warning for all 3. With that out of the way, let's check out why Batman Begins still holds up. Mostly. Like most intro superhero movies, Batman Begins can be broken down into 2 halves: the origin of the superhero, and the struggle the newfound hero has to deal with. And the origin half of this movie is phenomenal. This adoration comes from how much time is spent on the man beneath the cowl. The first half hour interweaves flashbacks of Bruce's training before staying in the present for the rest of the film. Nolan's specialty isn't just a gimmick here either. The time jumping is a great way to add insight into Bruce's character while still moving the story forward. As he gets stronger, we see more of what made him who he is, so far. And while we're on the subject, I like how the Wayne's deaths are handled here. The actual event happens in an instant, but the camera lingers on Bruce as the full weight of everything washes over him. The thing is, Nolan and co aren't doing anything to reinvent the wheel here. Even in 2005, we all knew who Batman was. Dead parents, brooding, and justice. It's that simple. But it's the extra pageantry that makes Batman Begins hit different. It's cool how you can see his sadness evolve into anger and guilt through the years. There's clear progression from the thirst for vengeance to justice. And that drive was so intense, the guy threw himself into prison just to bully criminals. It's crazy. No wonder why the Joker is drawn to him. The writing in the first act paints a vivid picture of who Bruce Wayne is, but Christian Bale deserves props too. He does an excellent job as this interpretation of the character. There's this fiery, brash nature that makes perfect sense for a rookie Bruce Wayne. While it's usually well hidden, you can see it come through in certain scenes due to the intensity of Bale's performance.
You didn't know my father. But I know the rage that drives you.
And of course, it's on full display as Batman. He's more than just angsty too. There's a dry sarcasm that's consistent with Bruce throughout the movie. And when he interacts with anyone that isn't Alfred, Lucius, or Rachel, Bale really sells the idiotic playboy persona. If there's one thing I would have preferred, it's that I wish the movie gave Bruce a little more. As any fan will tell you, Batman is more than a brooding vigilante.
Am I blue?
There's a scene later where he tosses Joffrey a goober, and it's kind of a missed opportunity to not show a softer side with something like an extended version of this. While angsty Batman is done very well, why not take the opportunity to show a little bit more of his compassion and humanity? It's pretty important to his character, and it would go a long way towards giving audiences more reasons to like him.
I'm dying very soon.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Could you stay with me? I'm scared.
But this is less a criticism and more of a preference. What we have is perfectly fine for the kind of movie Batman Begins is. It's not fair to ask Bruce Wayne to become Batman overnight, and as the first of what will become a trilogy, there should be some room to grow. Besides Bruce's characterization, his progression is a joy to watch. While skilled,
Got you! Broken arm! Boom! 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 Broken nose! Boom! 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 Broken nose! Boom! Ha! Gonna flip you!
it's obvious he's a wrecking ball of emotions looking for a target. I've always had a soft spot for training arcs because it's gratifying to watch characters grow mentally and physically. Batman Begins is no exception to this. It helps that Liam Neeson is doing a wonderful job as the mentor figure. That lofty Jedi way of speaking works here since Ducard is supposed to be someone with vast wisdom acquired through years of training. We'll talk more about him later, so put a pin in that for now. Also, the ice duel is the best fight in the entire movie. The choreography in this movie ain't great. But you wouldn't be able to tell that from this fight. The wide, sweeping shots are gorgeous, and it's mixed with meaningful dialogue, ninja stuff, and swordplay. Yeah, it's no warehouse brawl, or even anything like the Batman, but the bar for fisticuffs is low across the trilogy. Credit where credit is due. The other standout scene is in the flashback right before Bruce confronts Falcone. It's brief, but it's a fantastic use of wordless storytelling that tells us everything we need to know about what he's feeling and the origin of his moral code. And it's from the guy who penned scenes like this.
I'm the protagonist of this operation.
From there, things stay in the present after Bruce leaves his old life behind with nothing but the clothes on his back. After a montage of Bruce traveling the world, he gets a final test, and it's cool that in this scene, and the one after, we see glimpses of Bruce's ingenuity. We don't really get a whole lot of that later, but it's nice here nonetheless. Then, he gets the secret final test. Execute a criminal, which, of course he doesn't.
I will go back to Gotham and I will fight men like this, but I will not become an executioner.
We'll get to that. That aside, another cool thing about this scene is that this is the first time in the film you hear Hans Zimmer's leitmotif for Batman. I can't show you because Warner Brothers will get mad, but it's a neat audio indicator that shows this is the turning point where Bruce Wayne becomes Batman, not this. Bruce's return kicks off the second act, which is mostly devoted to catching us up to current affairs in Gotham and Bruce's further growth into the cowl. As Bruce DIYs his suit and checks out the local dealership, the supporting cast and villains take center stage. In the bad guy corner, Carmine Falcone and Scarecrow fill the void left by Ra's al Ghul. Falcone is a good representation of the normie criminals in Gotham, and he's out of the story by the halfway point anyway. Scarecrow, on the other hand, is a little more interesting. At first glance, he's the one best suited to take the mantle after Ra's bites the dust. After all, he's a proper member of Batman's Rogues Gallery. But in reality, he's marginally more important than Falcone in this movie. This isn't a bad thing either. The movie doesn't try to trick you into thinking he's a big deal. Not long after he's introduced, he mentions a mysterious benefactor, who we later learn is Ra's al Ghul. And thematically, Scarecrow makes a lot of sense since fear has been a core theme of the movie up to this point. Plus, a doctor using chemicals as weapons isn't that much of a stretch, unlike some of the other villains. It'd have been fun to see him in a larger role, but he's fine as an intermission. And he sticks around for the later movies. In the good guy corner, it doesn't need to be said that both Morgan Freeman and Gary Oldman do a wonderful job as Lucius Fox and Jim Gordon respectively. They're practically ripped straight from the other stories. But I can't really say the same thing about our next character, the non-comic, Nolan original, Rachel Dawes. Before going on, I want to ask you, what's her role in the story? You can answer this easily with everyone else. Scarecrow is a villain with thematic relevance, Gordon is one of the good boys, Fox is the gadget guy, and so on. So, what's Rachel's? As far as I can see, she serves 3 roles. She's another good person in the corrupt city, similar to Gordon. She serves as Bruce's moral compass to point him in the right directions. And lastly, she's his love interest. The first point makes sense. Gordon can't be the only paragon in Gotham, and Harvey Dent isn't canon yet. But as a romantic interest, she's about as good as the fight choreography. Now, to be completely fair to the writing team, it's really hard to capture the nuance and complexity of a romance between two people in only 1 to 3 hours. Romance works in something like Portrait of a Lady on Fire because the entire 2-hour runtime is dedicated to it. Compare that to something like a superhero movie where romance gets significantly less time and attention, and you can see why it's an uphill climb. Of course, there are exceptions to this. There's a lot of good shortcuts that can make a romance work in spite of the difficulty. Giving the characters some history, or chemistry between the actors or characters are great examples of this, just to name a few. Now, Rachel is Bruce's childhood friend, which is a good start. But that's all she has. Every scene Rachel has with Bruce is either talking about the plot or talking down to him in some way, usually both. And they don't have a cute back and forth when they argue. They just go,
"And that sounds like it's not my problem,"
and move on. When you look at the movie, it's hard to tell if the actors don't have chemistry, or if the writing behind them doesn't give them enough to work with. Even good actors won't pull their weight if the writing doesn't give them something.
She misses this place. So do I.
Yeah. But it's nothing without the people who made it what it was. Now there's only Alfred.
And you?
I'm not staying, Rachel.
You're just back for the hearing.
The only indicator Rachel is even romantically interested in Bruce comes at the end of the movie. By then, it's too little too late. Most of her screen time is dedicated to attorney work and talking down to Bruce. The romance in Batman Begins is no different from any generic movie romance. I'm sure we can all remember times when a movie just shoves two people together without actually building the relationship. If it doesn't add anything substantial, why bother adding it at all? And the thing is, romance can absolutely work here. The fact that one of Batman's most celebrated movies is, in part, a love story speaks volumes to how it can resonate with people when done well. If the romance in this movie was written well, it would make the next one even better. We, the audience, would actually be invested in Rachel's character when but it's not written well. As a result, Rachel is easily the weakest character in the movie. She's serviceable as another good person in Gotham, if not overshadowed a bit by Gordon, and underwhelming as a love interest. You may be wondering, hey, what about the moral compass point? Well,
Your father would be ashamed of you.
she ain't great at that either. You could cut the scenes where she guides Bruce and nothing changes. It's not that hard to see how Bruce could come to those conclusions on his own. He does in every other iteration anyway. Besides, Bruce doesn't need Rachel as a moral compass. He has a way better one. That honor goes to none other than Alfred Pennyworth. If there's one thing everyone agrees on, it's that Michael Caine kills it as Alfred. He's perfect as Bruce's true father figure. He's always there to let him know when he's going too far and to pick him back up when he falls. He does a wonderful job as Bruce's emotional anchor across the trilogy. So much of the latter half of Batman Begins and the sequels wouldn't work as well without his guiding presence. Alfred is so good, it completely overshadows anything Rachel tries to do or say. So, in short, the supporting cast in this movie works really well. It's just Rachel that sticks out like a sore thumb. It's not enough to bog down the movie, but it stands out when everything else is pretty solid. As we move on, there isn't a lot to say about the second act. Until the third act, it's basically Batman Year 1 featuring a Scarecrow. What I mean by that is you have all the hallmarks of your standard Batman story. You get it all, from beating up thugs, gentle persuasion,
Where were the other drugs going?
and skirmishes with the Rogues Gallery. While it's good, it's not going to knock your socks off. It's a solid way to show Batman using everything he's learned by this point in a simple but effective way. The plot comes to a head once Bruce apprehends Scarecrow. After another run-in with Gotham's finest, a pretty flashy and long one at that. You, gonna pay for that, Bruce? Batman returns to his manor to find his old mentor crashing the party, only to reveal that Ducard was the real Ra's al Ghul the whole time.
just some idiot with balloons.
Oh, is it?
Joking aside, making Ra's a title is a clever take on immortality instead of bringing in the Lazarus Pit. As far as Ra's himself, he's a respectable final boss. He's the embodiment of justice when it's taken too far, and it makes sense for Bats to face someone like him as his final test. But what holds Ra's back from the top tier of supervillains is his lack of time. He's an important character in the first act, but only gets so much time to actually be the villain. The most he does after coming back is beat up Bruce, monologue,
Commitment to justice.
Way of true justice. Justice is balance.
Justice!
and get beaten up. There's a lot of potential here based on his motivations and relationship to Bruce, but the movie ends before we see any of that used in a meaningful way. And he gets killed off, sorry is not saved, so this is all we get of him unlike Scarecrow. While Ra's is fine, he's slightly underwhelming since he returns so late. I'd have loved for him to show up earlier and show off some of his darker or more interesting traits, but the movie is 2.5 hours long as is, so I get why he doesn't. Unfortunately, it does make him the weakest of the trilogy's main villains. Then again, he's got stiff competition.
Oh my god! Ha! Joker! Anyways!
I got a Razzie Zazzy for Bang.
It's Bane! You know it's Bane! I'm here every day, Todd. Goddamn millennial.
So far, the first 2 acts of Batman Begins have been solid, complete with good character writing, and a well-paced, escalating plot. But while I've mostly been positive, in my opinion, the 3rd act is where the movie really falters. What always stood out to me was how much bigger the scale got, and how detached it is from where things started. The movie started out as a character-driven story, transitioned into classic hero hijinks, and devolved into a dumb action scene by the end. Sound familiar? There's more where that came from. Set pieces like this are unpopular because, for the most part, they lack the personal or emotional gravitas for a fulfilling finale. There's a world of difference watching the Avengers fight faceless jabronis versus, say, the original 3 Avengers facing the Mad Titan. And yeah, technically, Batman has personal stakes here. It's somewhat Bruce's fault for this mess since he saved Ra's earlier, and Ra's himself has a relationship with Bruce. But what's on paper is different from what's happening in the movie. What happens next is Rachel goes on an escort mission, Gordon borrows the Batmobile, and Bats beats up ninjas before hopping on the Justice Express to fight Ra's. I can forgive most of it if it was fun to watch, but it's really not. While the Gordon parts are cute, the rest isn't. Between stranger danger and the terrible fights, there isn't a lot that's very engaging. Then, we get to the final fight with Ra's, and it's this cramped, messy brawl that ends as quickly as it started. There's no weight to what should feel like an emotionally and thematically rich final fight. And I know a lot of this makes sense when you look at the script. The fear gas and microwave are set up in advance, so there's logical explanation for the chaos. And it makes sense that the final fight is cramped and short because they're on a speeding train. But making sense isn't the same thing as being entertaining. We all know what that looks like.
I'm the protagonist of this operation.
And the thing is, you don't need to do much to improve the climax in Batman Begins. It has all the makings of a great finale baked in. Imagine, if you will, a remix of the events. Keep everything as is, but cut the city and train parts in half, and scale things back to a final 1v1 with Ra's in the streets of Gotham. No train, no items, just one final duel. Not only would it present an opportunity for better choreography, it gives the main villain more screen time, and makes the most out of what could be a deeply personal duel between master and student. Even around 2005, this wasn't a novel idea. Raimi's first Spider-Man does this well by starting on a larger scale, then dialing it back to a personal, final confrontation. And many movies before and after this one have some variation of this. And if it's changed to a proper 1v1 in another area, Batman doesn't have to kill Ra's at the end. He didn't need to in the first place, but there's even less of a reason to leave him on a speeding train to die. I wouldn't have minded this if the movie perhaps waited to establish Batman's moral code until after this, but the first act clearly draws the line Batman won't cross. Yeah, technically he didn't kill Ra's, but leaving him to die isn't much better than the next Batman. I still don't mind it as much as some fans, but like with Rachel, it's such a weird writing choice when a good chunk of the movie is written pretty well. In any case, after Ra's gets sent to the Shadow Realm, Rachel confesses her love to Bruce, because of course she does. But she makes the sensible choice to not be with him until he's finished saving Gotham. Ooh, might want to rain check on that one. The movie closes with the birth of the bat signal and a teaser for what's to come. Which brings us back to the question posed earlier. Do you think Batman Begins holds up? For the most part, I'd say it does. The first act might be one of my favorite origin movies ever. The characters are quite good, most of the time, and it's paced and shot well, as you'd expect of a Nolan production. There isn't a lot to complain about in Batman Begins because the movie is strong where it counts. While I personally feel the romance and final act are underwhelming, among other things, it doesn't detract from the rest of the movie. At its core, Batman Begins does a good job of capturing why the character is so beloved by fans everywhere. Getting some of the character right is what separates it from films that try the dark, gritty take on a superhero. You can't just make everyone moody and violent and call it a day. You still need to nail some core elements of these characters. And I don't mean the little things like the backstory or the powers. That's the easy part. We don't like these characters because they're gods amongst men. We like them because of who they are and what they stand for. Getting back up after a tragic loss. Giving hope to the hopeless. Or doing everything in your power to ensure nobody experiences the pain you did as a child. If Nolan didn't accomplish at least a fraction of that, it would have fallen into the same pitfalls the others have. Is it a perfect interpretation of Batman? No way. I'm sure we can all name what we love in our ideal Batman movie. But it's just good enough to give fans like us something to enjoy, and to give newcomers a reason to join the club. Let me know what you think about Batman Begins in the comments, whether you liked it or hated it. I'd be interested in what you think nonetheless.
Half the fun of our relationship was the mystery. Now I know Batman is just some boring rich asshole with parental issues.
That's really reductive.
If there's any movie that needs no introduction, it's this one. The Dark Knight is one of the most revered superhero movies of all time. When it released back in 2008, it blew audiences away and became a pop culture sensation overnight.
I'm the Joker, baby!
But 2008 was a long time ago. Superhero movies have changed, and the title of Best Superhero Movie is way more competitive than it used to be. Normally, I propose a question like, do you think The Dark Knight holds up after so long? But like, come on. You know it's good, I know it's good, even the US government knows it's good. Instead, we'll chat about why it's so good. You'd think that's pretty obvious, but if that were the case, Warner Bros. Would have cracked the code by now. And for anyone checking this out, this is a follow-up to my Batman Begins video. It's not required viewing, but it will get referenced here and there. Check it out whenever you have the time. The cool thing about The Dark Knight is that it fixes almost every issue in Batman Begins. While there is still some dumb stuff,
I'm not wearing hockey pads.
There's not going to be nearly as much to pick apart. It's just that good. Some flaws will seem nitpicky, and I hope you understand that's not my goal. I love this movie, just like many of you. But we gotta be fair. And in the end, this movie is beloved for a reason. It's the golden goose Warner Bros. Has been chasing for years, and time will tell if they can catch it again. So, something I've talked about before was this notion of the superhero's first movie. Part of the movie is focused on their backstory or motivation, and once they don the suit, we pivot to something that puts the hero to the test. But I haven't mentioned the issues with this formula. Origin stories need to spend enough time getting us invested into the character. Simple enough, sure, but that alone is easy to screw up.
Her?
And when you add villain shenanigans, world building, or romance to the mix, it gets more complicated. That's a lot even for a skilled writer. It's one of the reasons there's such a wide range from Thor to Spider-Verse. But superhero sequels are where the fun begins. Because there's no origin baggage, the writers have more freedom to write a compelling story. This is why sequels like The Dark Knight are so good. This movie is one giant test of resolve for all the heroes. The first act revolves around the final push for Gotham's salvation. Bruce and Gordon spent roughly a year cleaning up Gotham, and it shows. The Gotham we saw in Begins was this dirty, grimy mess you could practically smell through the screen. And it gets a really nice glow up in The Dark Knight. The only thing left to take care of are the remaining crime lords. Gordon mentioned some other guy causing trouble in the neighborhood, but Batman just kinda goes,
And that sounds like it's not my problem.
The first act is a lot like a classic Batman story. Beating up criminals, rooftop rendezvous with Gordon, and Bruce Wayne flexing his wealth.
Sure that they'll let us. Oh, they should. I own the place.
Kind of like what we saw in Batman Begins. But you can see the difference it makes when there's no origin story to worry about. The middle chunk of Batman Begins is good, but it suffers from being slapped onto the origin story. It doesn't really have time to evolve in a satisfying way. If anything, it devolves. Which is the opposite of what we see in The Dark Knight. Since the Batman capers are at the start, it has time to escalate beyond your average Batman caper. And speaking of escalation, I couldn't think of a better word to describe the transition into the second act. Through the combined efforts of Gordon, Batman, and Harvey Dent, hundreds of criminals are locked up. Gotham's future is looking brighter than ever. Until... While I haven't talked about him so far, the Joker is just as important as the others in Act 1. As much as the first act is about the heroes working together, it's also about the Joker's rise to power. Even though we saw how much of a threat he is, both the mob,
Two-bit whack job, wears a cheap purple suit and makeup. He's not the problem, he's a nobody.
and Batman don't take him seriously. By the time they realize what he's capable of,
I've made a huge mistake.
it's too late. For this version of Mr. J, the Nolans pulled inspiration from famous comics like The Killing Joke.
Sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes another. If I'm going to have a past, I prefer it to be multiple choice.
They threw in some other inspirations too, like the German 1933 film The Testament of Dr. Mabuse.
Introduce a little anarchy.
Together, it creates a Joker that's both radically different from past versions, yet still really familiar. And of course, we can't talk about the Joker without talking about the man behind the makeup. Heath Ledger did a phenomenal job bringing this character to life. It's unreal how much work he put into this performance. Everything from researching the source material, to spending weeks alone writing the Joker's thoughts in a diary. I'll link a few articles in the description. It's incredible how much work he put in. And it shows. He steals a scene every time he shows up.
I'm a man of my word.
You know performance is good when you overshadow such a star-studded ensemble. But before I get carried away, the Joker's first murders start the second act. The tension ramps up as the Joker moves from average citizens to high-profile targets, with Batman doing his best to hunt him down. And the dynamic between Batman and the Joker is what makes this movie so good.
Wayne Tech promised an electric car by this year. I put a deposit down. Where's my goddamn electric car, Bruce?
I'm of the opinion that any Joker needs Batman to really shine. You can use the Joker elsewhere, sometimes really well,
Cinnamon raisins? You know I hate raisins!
and other times not so much. But taking Batman out of the equation loses what makes the Joker a great antagonist. I know the obvious counterpoint is Joker, but even though it's good, you have to admit it's barely a Joker movie. It's a lot more like Taxi Driver than any Joker story. And I say that as someone who likes both movies. The Dark Knight has all the hallmarks of what makes this dynamic a classic. The dichotomy of a good but flawed person and the embodiment of true evil has fantastic storytelling potential. Because as evil as the Joker is, he needs someone equally good to oppose him. Many of the best Batman and Joker stories revolve around how far the Joker will push Batman, and how much is too much for Bruce. Just like The Dark Knight. But as much as I love this pair, it is really overused these days. You see the Joker so often, and it's usually the same old, "We're not so different, you and I," spiel that we always hear from the Joker. Which isn't even true, by the way, but it happens so often people take it as fact nowadays. I wouldn't mind if the Joker took a hiatus for a little bit. You know, maybe give some of the other villains a chance to shine, like Phantom or Man-Bat. But let's be real, you know Warner Brothers isn't letting that happen. That aside, the other cool thing about this movie is that it feels like a true ensemble. The Dark Knight is as much a Harvey Dent and Gordon story as it is a Batman one. I didn't talk much about Gordon last time, but The Dark Knight is when he really comes into his own. He gets overlooked because, well, look at his friends, but he's awesome in this movie. His quick judgment saves lives on multiple occasions, and he's the one that comes up with the plan to catch the Joker. And while his progression isn't as obvious as Harvey's, it does show later.
I want Lau alive. The Joker, either way.
Jim, by the book, Gordon, is ready to kill the Joker. I kinda wish the movie made a bigger deal about that. It's easy to miss since there's so much going on, but it's cool that even Gordon is pushed to his limit. Anywho, Gordon's death forces Bruce and Harvey's hand, leading to Harvey taking the fall for Batman. A chase ensues, culminating in a thematic showdown between our hero and villain. And after Batman remembers killing is wrong, Gordon pulls a fast one on the Joker, which ends up being part of the Joker's master plan anyways, somehow. And after a game of good cop Batman, the Joker reveals the next stage of his plan.
Choose between one life or the other. Your friend, the district attorney, or his blushing bride to be.
And as a result of the Joker's reads, Rachel dies. And Harvey's sanity goes with her. As our heroes mourn, this is a good time to discuss one of the film's weaker parts.
The Batman.
The Dark Knight himself doesn't really change much in this movie, at least compared to the last one. But I don't think that's a bad thing. As you'd expect of a good Batman-Joker story, Batman is forced into situations without easy answers. He has to rely on his strength of will and resourcefulness to make it through. Batman going through drastic change might undermine the entire story. But as good as Batman is in this movie, this is when some of the writing lets him down. And it's a similar problem we see in Batman Begins. Begins did a good job exploring Bruce's backstory and motivation. In other words, the bare minimum for the character. It's really well done and easily the best part of the movie. But it's here where you see the limitations of doing the bare minimum for a character. A big thing I pointed out in Batman Begins was how it would have benefited from showing more of Bruce's personality. While he has a personality,
I trust you don't have me followed on my day off.
If you ever took one, I might.
Being sassy with your friends isn't enough in the long run. The audience needs a little more to really connect with a character. Bale's Batman is good, but there's a reason this Batman didn't resonate with people like many of the Marvel heroes did. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight don't highlight why we should root for Batman, other than him being the hero to the villain. Something I didn't talk about last time was this whole idea of Batman as a symbol. It's one of the recurring themes across the trilogy, but audiences don't connect with symbols, they connect with people. Batman goes through a lot in this movie. He talks about how difficult things are, but we don't really get a chance to hear how he feels. He's stoic and resolute all the way to the end, to a fault. For example, this is his reaction to Rachel's death.
She was gonna wait for me, Alfred. Dad doesn't know.
My guy, your best friend just got turned into paste. Could you do a little better than like a single tear? A common complaint I've seen is that Bale's Batman is boring, and that The Dark Knight is really the Joker movie. And as much as I'd like to disagree, I kind of get it. Batman's personality is really subdued.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
And he's not really given much else to compensate in this movie. Both Begins and Rises give Bruce a little more introspection, and Bale gets more scenes to show off his acting chops. A scene like Batman expressing more emotion might seem really minor, but moments like that are crucial for getting us to connect with the character.
I know I made a promise, but I didn't see this coming. I didn't count on being happy.
They show there's a human worth rooting for underneath the mask. And you don't even need to do big emotional scenes. It's not like more emotion save the next movie. Little things like kindness or empathy would go a long way. And no, the whole "hey kid, you like Wayne Tech" scene doesn't count. There should be some actual human bonding.
Since you indoctrinated Robin into crime fighting at the ripe old age of 9.
Robin needed to help bring the men who murdered his family to justice.
So he could turn out like you?
So that he wouldn't.
If that was the Batman we saw more of in The Dark Knight, more people would actually be invested in this character, instead of being swept off their feet by the Joker. You don't even have to look far into Batman lore for a solution. There's more than enough to work with in The Dark Knight. Out of the entire trilogy, this is the one where he gets to be a real hero. He tries his hardest to save people throughout the movie. I know saving people is part of the job description, but it's easy to overlook when there's so much else going on in the movie. Especially since the movie doesn't make a big deal out of it. And in another change from some Batman, this Batman is really idealistic.
This city just showed you that it's full of people ready to believe in good.
There's some good in this world, Joker. And it's worth fighting for.
Most versions are really grumpy and pragmatic, but this one has so much faith in humanity. It's a little too unfounded if you really think about it. You can tell there's an amazing Batman in here that audiences would adore. The Nolans and Ledger put so much work into the Joker, and it paid off in spades. And they probably could have put a little more effort into Batman as well. Just because you did a good job last time, mind you, good, not great, you shouldn't ignore the main character of your movie. Batman embodies the best of humanity by the end of this movie. He deserves more than being labeled a boring character with a silly voice. And at the same time, it's not like the movie highlights his heroism as much as I did. He gets overshadowed by both the Joker and Harvey Dent. And even though I spent the last few minutes complaining about Batman, I still don't think he's that bad. Putting characters in impossible situations is one of my favorite story beats. And that's exactly what this movie is for Batman. As stoic and underwritten he is. It says a lot when a movie's weaker part is still pretty good. In any case, the second act concludes with Dent's talk with the Joker and the announcement of the Joker's final plan.
When it comes to human ethics, I just know more than you.
And it's here when Dent makes his full turn into Two-Face. He's pretty good for a third act villain. While the Joker is Batman's opposite, this version of Two-Face is more like his Dark Mirror, a fellow vigilante also pursuing justice, albeit in a twisted way. Dent works really well as the Act 1 good boy and the second villain in Act 3. There's only one thing that kind of sucks about him: Rachel. Despite how much I complained about her last time, I don't think she's that bad here. It's partly because she isn't around as long, but Maggie G does a really good job with her limited time. She's not nearly as wooden as Katie Holmes was.
The man who vanished. He never came back at all.
Harvey may not know you well enough to understand when you're making fun of him, but I do.
No, I meant every word.
But like the last movie, it's the writing that lets her down. And it affects Harvey because his entire fall from grace is because of Rachel. And honestly, it's a little hard to buy it. Kind of like another character.
What have I done?
These two aren't that bad on screen, but when you think about it, they only knew each other for about a year. Rachel's supposed to be a substitute for Mrs. Dent like in The Long Halloween, but it doesn't have quite the same effect. I don't think their relationship is unbelievable per se, and it's not like we have 3 more hours to build it up, but it is pretty hard to care about this relationship as much as Harvey does. And boy, does Harvey care.
He's gonna kill Rachel.
Rachel! Rachel! Rachel!
Apparently he cared way more than she did.
I'm going to marry Harvey Dent.
On one hand, you have really good scenes like Harvey's breakdown in the hospital. It's such a good example of wordless storytelling. And then he says things like,
"Where my family died."
And it's hard to take him seriously. Come on, Chris, you can write better than that. Then again,
I'm the protagonist of this operation.
And this rolls over into another issue. A common trend in every Nolan movie is his reliance on telling over showing. While it's not as bad in The Dark Knight like some of his other movies, it's still here. Harvey's love for Rachel is one example, but the other big one is Gotham City. There's a lot of emphasis on Gotham the city, but not really a lot on Gotham the people. We're told that Harvey gives the people hope, and that the city desperately needs him. You think it's something that's really minor, but it's something that the movie makes a big deal out of, and we're only told about it through snippets of dialogue.
Gotham needs a hero with a face. You're the symbol of hope I could never be.
Batman gets a fan club, but Harvey would benefit from one too, or at the very least, the perspective of the average Gotham citizen. That sounds a heck of a lot better than the scenes with Reese or the comic relief cop.
I didn't sign up for this! You can't stop here, we're like sitting ducks! I'm gonna be a comedian.
You could work this into other parts of the movie too. Bruce has a lot of faith in the people of Gotham, and we don't get a chance to see Gotham's goodness until the very end. It'd be pretty cool if the film showed the people of Gotham at their best, as well as at their worst. It'd add more basis to Bruce's beliefs, and create another layer of ambiguity to the finale. If we saw how good they can be earlier, there'd be more guessing as to whether good or evil will triumph by the end. And while I did just point out a few flaws, I don't think they're genuine problems. The story being told is still engaging and well written. Dent's arc and thematic relevance are still interesting in spite of how silly his downfall is. And Eckhart's performance is so good, it saves some of the shaky writing.
How does that feel? I wouldn't!
And as unfounded as Batman's faith in humanity is, it's a great contrast to the Joker's beliefs. There's way more to love about this movie than there is to hate. It's like what I said about an underwritten Batman. It says a lot when the most you can say is,
"Please, sir, I want some more."
And speaking of love, the climax in The Dark Knight is one of the best in any superhero movie. The fight to the Joker escalates as new elements like the fake hostages and the SWAT team are introduced. The choreography is still dumb, but it's way easier to ignore this time. It's actually really cool watching Batman try his hardest to fight and save everyone in the building. And while this is going on, the prisoner's dilemma with the boats adds additional stakes and tension to the battle. Not only are Batman's skills pushed to their limit, but the fairies are the final clash of his ideals versus the Joker's. It takes so much of what made the movie good, like escalation and the character dichotomies, and uses it to create a thematically rich final battle. It's the kind of climax I wanted from Batman Begins, and I'm so glad Nolan was able to deliver here. But as good as the climax is, there's still more. The showdown with Two-Face is the real finale, and it's a fitting, thematic conclusion to the film. We started the movie with these three, and it's only fitting that it ends with them. Like many of the movie's best scenes, it brings the character arcs and underlying themes to the forefront. Batman and Gordon come face to face with their worst fears, and when all is said and done, Batman is forced to take action one more time. I complained about Batman not saving Ra's last time because it's just so out of character. Begins goes out of its way to set up Batman's one rule, only for him to throw it in the trash at the end. But I don't think that's a problem this time around. We've seen Batman do whatever it takes to save people throughout the movie. If an innocent person's life is at stake, it makes sense for Batman to do what needs to be done, even if that means breaking his one rule. While he chose to let Ra's die, he didn't choose to kill Dent. He chose to save Gordon Jr. I know it's not a huge distinction, but it's a distinction nonetheless. And in the aftermath, things couldn't be bleaker for the heroes. Gotham's beacon of hope is tainted, and Batman himself has lost friends, allies, even his one rule is broken. But at the end, he's still standing. Despite how much he's lost, he's still willing to do whatever it takes for the greater good.
I killed those people. That's what I can be.
No, you can't. You're not.
I'm whatever Gotham needs me to be.
Not because it's his job, but because it's the right thing to do. And if that's not heroic, I don't know what is. I think it's beautiful that at the end of such a grim movie, there's that one ray of hope to cling to. That despite how much you lose and how much people can change, there are still those who remain strong. It's hard to believe that there's more hope in a Batman movie than any Superman movie that followed.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
There's a lot we can argue about when it comes to movies, but The Dark Knight is rarely one of them. It takes characters we know and uses them to tell a story rife with transient morality, loss, and most importantly, hope. It's a superhero movie that doesn't feel like a superhero movie. And yet, it wouldn't be the same without those heroes and villains. And in a lot of ways, I owe my love of movies to this one. It's one of the movies that made me look at films a little differently. It sounds cheesy, I know, but if I didn't watch this film at the right time, there's a good chance I never even bothered with movies like Citizen Kane or Singing in the Rain. And I wouldn't be surprised if anyone watching has a similar story. And it's like I said at the intro, the crown of best superhero movie is so much more competitive now. While that's a fun discussion worth having another day, there's not a doubt in my mind this movie will always be one of my favorites. And I'm sure many people out there feel exactly the same. And as much as I love The Dark Knight, I'm excited for the day a Batman movie comes along that's even better. Because it sure as hell wasn't the next one.
You're probably wondering to yourself, hey Bane, why no door? Because where would you escape to? You are in a pit!
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards.
It wouldn't be that strange to say that The Dark Knight Returns is one of the most influential comics of all time. Written by Frank Miller back in 1986, it's a dark, gripping story, rife with character drama, political intrigue, and biting social commentary.
But as for what's going on in Gotham, it's not my row to hoe, now is it?
Sorry, guys, I've got a whole state to run.
We've just appointed a new police commissioner, and I'm not about to interfere.
Even if you're not familiar with the Batman comics, there's a good chance you felt its influence somewhere. This comic's legacy has spread far and wide, and the Batman we know today can trace the roots back to this very story. In 2013, the story was adapted into a two-part animated film simply titled The Dark Knight Returns. This adaptation is fantastic. It's one of the best DC animated films to date, and it does an excellent job at capturing the spirit of the original story. Instead, we're going to talk about these jabronis: Chris Nolan's The Dark Knight Rises, and Zack Snyder's Batman vs. Superman. Rises and BVS aren't direct adaptations of The Dark Knight Returns, but they both take elements from the original story and retool them in ways to fit the films, with very mixed results. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The Dark Knight Rises and BVS are deeply flawed. There's a time and a place to get into those flaws.
Cryptic metaphor!
But for now, we'll stick to the ones specific to The Dark Knight Returns. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but with Rises and BVS, the imitation hurts a lot more than it helps. There's many reasons The Dark Knight Returns is still talked about today, and we're going to get into what made it so good and what the live action films have failed to recapture. The history behind The Dark Knight Returns is almost as important as the comic itself. Like every superhero, Batman has gone through his fair share of change over time. The Batman of the 40s and 50s wasn't that different from the one we see today. Early comics followed in the footsteps of detective stories, with a dark, gloomy mood to match. Even Batman himself wasn't above a little murder. Just like today.
But I don't have to save you.
Cool motive, still murder.
This took a turn around the late 50s. Batman's rougher edges were ironed out, and his stories gradually shifted towards a lighter tone. But by the 60s, the pendulum swung a little too far, as we can see with...
You risked your life to save that riffraff in the bar?
They may be drinkers, Robin, but they're also human beings.
The 1966 Batman series was emblematic of the times, as a much more campy and comedic take on the Caped Crusader. And they're a lot of fun. The series plays out like this absurd sitcom where everyone is in on the joke.
Well, into the soup?
Why not?
But the series was a far cry from the Batman of yesteryear, and for over a decade, the campy, lighthearted Batman was the one the general public knew best. Until 1986. Frank Miller's graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns, served as a direct response to the campiness of the 60s and 70s. It was dark, it was violent, and most importantly, it was good. The novel was a critical and financial success, and it led the way for other Batman stories to follow in its footsteps. Without The Dark Knight Returns, we might never have gotten Batman the Animated Series, Batman Black Mirror, or The Dark Knight. As far as the novel itself, The Dark Knight Returns is the story of an older Bruce Wayne. It's been about a decade since he last donned the cowl, with the death of the second Robin, Jason Todd, being the main reason for his retirement. As for Bruce, he's a shell of his former self. His entire life was dedicated to the pursuit of justice, and with no Batman, he's a man without purpose or emotion. But while Bruce Wayne has lost his way, the world around him has kept moving forward. Crime in Gotham is at an all-time high, and the criminals themselves are more violent than the thugs of the past. And as Bruce sees Gotham grow worse and worse, years of repressed trauma and agony wash over him all at once.
You try to hold me back, but you're weak.
When the pain subsides, a single burning desire remains, the same fire that burned within him decades ago.
The time has come.
And so, after a long hiatus, the Dark Knight finally returns to his city. But the Gotham he returns to is not the same one he fought for. New threats are more formidable than he thought, and old enemies are just as deadly as before. The Dark Knight Returns is a story about Bruce adapting to this new world, and whether or not he can survive in it. Batman's resurgence eventually makes national news, and the US government is forced to take matters into their own hands.
You know what I'm asking.
Sir, I can talk to him, but...
I'd just hate for things to get out of hand.
The showdown between Batman and Superman is the climax of the story, and after a brutal final battle, Batman defeats Superman, but at the cost of his own life. And after 55 years, Bruce Wayne is finally laid to rest. Or so we thought. The story reveals that Batman faked his death and intends to continue his war on crime. but this time he'll work in the shadows and act as a mentor for the next generation of Batmen and women.
I spent 10 years looking for a good death. This'll be a good life.
If any of that sounds familiar, it probably is. Many Batman stories have pulled elements from this one and tweaked them in ways that fit that specific story. The Dark Knight Returns isn't perfect by any means, but it's a story with a rich history behind it, and it was written with that history in mind. While the story does still hold up, some parts don't work as well in the modern era, at least not without some major adjustments. Which brings us to The Dark Knight Rises. Rises draws inspiration from many stories, with the main ones being Nightfall, No Man's Land, and of course, The Dark Knight Returns. Now, Rises is a very different kind of story. The Dark Knight Returns is a story about change and adaptation, while The Dark Knight Rises is a much more emotionally rich, character-driven story. But Rises does follow a similar story progression, especially with the film's beginning and ending. Rises takes place 8 years after The Dark Knight, and Batman has gone into retirement due to guilt, depression, and a lack of purpose. The death of Harvey Dent led to the creation of the Dent Act, a piece of legislature that, as the mayor explains, gives the Gotham PD the teeth they need to bring criminals to justice. Gotham is in an era of peace, and as far as Bruce is concerned, Batman isn't needed anymore. But whispers of a criminal uprising reach Bruce's ears, and he's forced to come out of retirement to save Gotham once more. The next inspiration can be seen in Batman's fights with Bane, which play out similar to the mutant leader fights in The Dark Knight Returns. In both stories, Batman faces off with a more powerful enemy, but loses. Badly.
I will break the bat!
He almost dies because he's used to relying on his strength and martial prowess, which doesn't work when the opponent is so much stronger than him. But he learns from his defeat, and for the second fight, he doesn't fight harder, he fights smarter. By using his intellect and coming up with a proper strategy, he's able to turn the tables on his opponent and secure the victory. And finally, The Dark Knight Rises ends with Batman faking his death in order to pursue another life, just like The Dark Knight Returns. Of the story beats of this film mimics, this is the one that works the best. Batman dies so that Bruce Wayne will live on, which is a fitting end to this Batman's journey. As for the other story beats, they don't work nearly as well. They fit the story in Rises, but there's always a little asterisk right beside it. Let's start with the time skip. Out of all the references to The Dark Knight Returns, this is the one that stands out the most. It works as an homage to Bruce's retirement in The Dark Knight Returns, but beyond that, it doesn't add that much to the story. In The Dark Knight Returns, the passage of time serves a very distinct purpose. It's almost the foundation of the entire story, and it's used to show the audience that the world has changed. Gotham is worse than ever, the government is more controlling, and Batman's allies are growing fewer and fewer. There's a strong emphasis on world building within the story, and we're constantly given details about the current status quo and how the characters are adjusting to it. The characters will often talk about the current state of affairs, and the story uses news segments to highlight any current events.
Both Joker and the Batman, who himself left dozens of police hospitalized, are now fugitives from the law, kidnapping and murdering young children, a line even the mutants hadn't crossed until now.
This just in, a spokesman for the Ridley chewing gum family has revealed that the mutants have kidnapped Kevin Ridley, the 2-year-old heir to the Ridley fortune.
We're not just told about the world either. We're always given a chance to see it for ourselves. The future is a mess, and that's made abundantly clear throughout The Dark Knight Returns. So, when we circle back to The Dark Knight Rises, the time skip is borderline non-existent. If you told me that Rises took place 2 or 3 years after The Dark Knight, I'd believe you. The biggest change from The Dark Knight to Rises is the Dent Act, but the other changes are really minor. Batman got weaker and built a nuke, Barbara Gordon left and took the kids, and that's it. For an 8-year time skip, you'd think a lot more would have changed. Nolan's explanation for the time skip is, to paraphrase, so that the sacrifice in The Dark Knight means something, and he wanted to show that through the passage of time. But that gets into something he struggled with throughout his career, telling over showing.
It made Gotham a safer place than it was at the time of his death 8 years ago. This city has seen a historic turnaround.
All you need to know is that there are 1,000 inmates in Blackgate Prison as a direct result of the Dent Act. These are violent criminals.
When you and Dent cleaned up the streets, you cleaned them good. Pretty soon we'll be chasing down Overdue library books.
The characters talk about how much better Gotham is, but a few lines of dialogue isn't good world building. The Dent Act did make Gotham a better place, but we never get a chance to see that Gotham for ourselves. As far as the movie is concerned, a lot has changed, but it doesn't feel that way. The 8-year gap doesn't add to the world in Rises, and the story additions aren't meaningful enough. It feels like a shortcut, like an attempt to add depth where it's needed, and to get the characters and plot to where they need to be. And it's a shortcut that wasn't really needed to begin with. The time skip made Batman weaker, but he doesn't need a reason to lose to Bane. As a wise man once said,
"Please, no Johns."
This Bane is trained by Ra's al Ghul and is literally built different. It's not that hard to see how Bane could just overpower Batman, time skip or not. And all the other plot points, like the fusion reactor, could easily happen in 3 or 4 years. The time skip is a lazy shortcut at best, and at worst, it actually weakens parts of the entire trilogy. For example, The Dark Knight ends on such a powerful note. Batman takes it upon himself to shoulder Dent's sins, and he's willing to keep fighting for Gotham no matter what. It demonstrates an incredible strength of character, and it's one of Batman's most heroic moments in the entire trilogy. Then we get to Rises, and instead of fighting for Gotham from the shadows, it turns out he quit, and did nothing but sulk for almost a decade. Or to be more specific, he sulked and took up a new hobby, neutron bombs. My guy could have just bought a stand mixer, like a normal depressed person. And it gets worse when you realize that this Batman has spent more time globetrotting, training, and being sad than he spent actually being Batman. It's ambiguous how much time passes between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, but the Joker implies it's only been about a year between films.
Let's wind the clocks back a year. These cops and lawyers wouldn't dare cross any of you.
I know the Joker is the last person you should take at face value, but there's not many reference points for the trilogy's timeline. So when you map out this Batman's career, it looks like this. Bruce Wayne drops out of Princeton and travels the world for 7 years. He returns to Gotham and spends anywhere from a few months to a year as Batman. Harvey dents his face, and Batman goes into exile for the next 8 years. This isn't a veteran Batman coming out of retirement. This is a rookie Batman who just started his 2nd year of work. Imagine having an entire trilogy to yourself and still being the least experienced Batman to date. And that includes the newest Batman, who, by the way, is already in his 2nd year of crime fighting. There were a lot of ways for the time skip to work in The Dark Knight Rises, but as it is, there's just not enough there to make it work. Which is a shame, because the time skip in Rises offers a lot of storytelling potential. But with the way it's handled, it's really underwhelming. And I'd say similar things about the Bane fights, or specifically, the second fight.
Oh my, who caused this catastrophe?
For the most part, the first one is fine. It's actually less of a Dark Knight Returns homage and more of a reference to Nightfall, the story where Bane breaks Batman. It's one of the better fights in the trilogy, if not the best fight, and it does an excellent job at establishing how powerful Bane is. As for their second fight, it's a letdown. Batman does defeat Bane, kind of.
I have dreams too!
But the issue is less with the idea and more so with the execution. The Bane fights follow a similar pattern to the mutant leader fights in The Dark Knight Returns. Like with Bane, Batman challenges the mutant leader, but is totally outmatched by a younger, stronger foe. As he tends to his wounds, he points out exactly where he went wrong.
Perhaps your judgment was impaired. I tried to match his savagery last time. That was my mistake. I have to be smarter.
So for the second fight, he comes prepared. He catches the mutant leader off guard. He moves the fight to a location where he has the advantage, and he chooses his blows with surgical precision.
That a tickle? That was a nerve bundle in your deltoid. Might not have hurt, but you won't be moving that arm for a while.
And he doesn't just win the fight, he completely and utterly defeats his opponent. It's one of the coolest parts of the story because the fight is over before it even begins. Instead of relying on brute strength, Batman turns to his most powerful weapon, his brain. And technically, that still applies in The Dark Knight Rises. In the pit, one of the prisoners tells Bruce about Bane's weakness, the mask. And when Batman returns to Gotham, he defeats Bane by fighting smarter. There's a moment in the fight when he starts targeting Bane's mask, giving him the edge he needs to win the fight. And sure, the whole brains over brawn thing does work, but like, come on. Batman's master plan basically boils down to punch him in the mouth a few times. And that's really, really underwhelming for a character who's known for his intelligence. not to mention how silly the fight looks, but that's a conversation for another day. Nolan had the right idea for the second Bane fight, but the execution falls flat. It pales in comparison to its counterpart, in pretty much any version where Bane gets to fight Batman, and it's really lackluster for what should be the film's climactic battle. It's neat that Rises borrows a lot from The Dark Knight Returns, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore how clumsy it's put together. You have a time skip that barely changes the status quo, and a brains over brawn battle that barely has any brains.
Bane, you gullible fool!
An ending with Batman faking his death works, but the other story beats don't work as well. The ideas are there, but the execution to bring them to life isn't, which is the exact same issue we'd see a few years later. BVS doesn't borrow as much from The Dark Knight Returns, but it borrows two major elements. The first is Batman himself. Like The Dark Knight Returns, the BVS Batman is much older and more violent. This has its own set of issues, but they extend well beyond BVS, so I'll keep it brief. But the darkness in The Dark Knight Returns is a result of the times. The story is grim, and the characters are written as extreme versions of themselves, as if all their worst qualities are dialed up to 11. It worked back then because it served a purpose. The world needed a reminder of what these stories could be like, and The Dark Knight Returns was the perfect wake-up call. But as good as The Dark Knight Returns was, it's not the best indicator of what makes these stories good. These stories, and the heroes in them, are at their best when there's balance. Like the dichotomy of someone who is a man first and a god second. Or someone who is unquestionably a good person, but dealing with darkness of their own. And when you take away that balance, it becomes way less interesting. And it's not really necessary either. Nowadays, we already have an idea of what darker, more subversive stories look like, DC and otherwise. Making the characters dark and violent can work, especially if it serves a purpose for the story being told. Hell, that's the entire point of The Dark Knight Returns. But in BVS, the overt darkness doesn't really add anything. At most, it takes characters and ideas that were already interesting and makes them more shallow and one-dimensional. And that brings us to the second point, and the one that's in the title, Batman vs. Superman. The story in BVS is almost entirely original, but the fight itself is a direct reference to the battle in The Dark Knight Returns. The fight itself looks fine. For all his faults, Zack Snyder knows how to make scenes look good. And it looks 10 times better than anything we saw in the last movie. But aesthetics alone do not make a good fight. If the writing behind a fight is lacking, the visuals can only help so much. And the writing in BVS is exactly what brings it down. In BVS, Batman sees Superman as a threat to humanity. He's afraid that at any point, Superman can erase millions in the blink of an eye. It's not the most complex motivation, but it's reasonable all things considered. As for Superman's motivation, he doesn't really have one. He doesn't have a reason to seek Batman out, and the only reason he does so is because of Lex Luthor's scheme. So on one side, you have a stalker who wants to fight Superman, and a Superman who has to be blackmailed into fighting Batman. It feels unnatural, and by all accounts, it shouldn't have happened. In BVS, Batman and Superman barely know each other. They interact like 3 times throughout the movie. So when we get to the titular battle, there's next to no drama going into the fight. I've seen more drama in parody episodes of Community. And to top it off, their battle doesn't even get a proper resolution. Doomsday shows up, and the climax turns into a dumb CGI battle. Again. For a fight that's meant to be the selling point of the movie, the actual fight between Batman and Superman doesn't have a lot going for it. The visuals are fine, but otherwise, it's forced, impersonal, and lacks any dramatic weight. Which isn't something I would say about the battle it's referencing. In The Dark Knight Returns, the Batman and Superman we see aren't strangers. There's a sense of history between the two, and from the way they talk with each other, you can tell they have a good understanding of how the other's mind works.
You cost me hours of work last night.
Why do you always have to be like this? You played right into their hands last time. When the parents' groups and the subcommittees came after us, you're the one they pointed to.
But things are different now. Superman answers to the US government, and the government sees Batman as a liability. He's too radical, too controversial, and according to them, he has no place in this world anymore. So, the US orders Superman to take care of the threat, just like he's done before.
Still hurts when it's cold.
And Clark does not want to fight Bruce. He's not even happy with his current arrangement with the government, but to him, it's the only way he can continue saving lives. He tries to reason with Bruce, because at the end of the day, Superman is still Superman. He's a good person at heart, and he doesn't want to resort to violence unless he has to. But Bruce can't afford to back down. As extreme as his methods are, he is making Gotham a better place, and he doesn't need the government, or Superman, meddling in places they don't belong.
Crime Alley.
It was never a matter of if these two are going to fight. With where they're at and who they answer to, it was only a matter of when. And unlike BVS, their fight in The Dark Knight Returns has a proper resolution, and it's not as simple as one character beating the other. Batman wins, but by the skin of his teeth. It takes everything he has just to survive, all while Superman is going easy on him and still trying to get through to Bruce. Batman defeats Superman, but that isn't the real victory. The real victory is in the aftermath. Once Superman realizes that Bruce faked his death, he's willing to look the other way as long as Batman stays quiet from now on. There's a reason this is an iconic showdown. It's not just a fight between heroes with decades of history, or a man fighting a god. It's a battle between former friends who don't want to fight, but have to, because too much has changed over time. And that's the kind of drama that makes for an incredible fight.
Don't touch him.
On the surface, it looks like the fight in BVS. But the lead up, motivations, and resolution couldn't be more different, and that makes all the difference. At best, the version we see in BVS is a shallow imitation. You can tell Zack Snyder loves The Dark Knight Returns, and he was dying to put this fight on the big screen. But it was never going to work as is. This showdown just doesn't work without the build-up. Batman and Superman barely know each other, and we don't really know them either. We've only had 2 movies to learn about this Superman, and there's a good chance we might not even like what we see. And we've had even less time to learn about this Batman. This movie should never have been the sequel to Man of Steel, and it should never have been made before a proper Justice League movie. Warner Bros. And Snyder wanted the payoff, but they didn't want to put in the work to earn it, and it shows. Instead of an emotionally charged battle between former allies, what we got was a cold, lifeless scuffle between total strangers. And speaking as someone who loves Batman and Superman, it could have been so much more.
Batman, it's really you!
Now, The Dark Knight Rises and BVS are obviously very divisive, and mimicking another story, let alone just The Dark Knight Returns, is just one of their many issues. But they both suffer from the same problem. They borrowed elements from The Dark Knight Returns, but didn't put in the effort to make it work. And it would have been so easy. There were many, many opportunities for these films to copy elements from The Dark Knight Returns and make them their own. Instead of a prologue focused on Bane's stupid hijacking, we could have had one that shows how much Gotham has changed since The Dark Knight. Or a movie that builds the relationship between Batman and Superman so that their eventual showdown has actual weight to it. The Dark Knight Returns isn't this flawless, unadaptable story, but many of the narrative decisions stem from the era surrounding it. It was the perfect Batman story for that point in time, and while it worked back then, you can't blindly copy parts of the story and expect the same result. An older Batman coming out of a decade-long hiatus is a good premise, but it doesn't work as well when the Batman in question is still a spring chicken in a sequel that only came out 4 years after the last movie. A showdown between superheroes would be amazing to see, but not as a second movie in a cinematic universe. The story beats on The Dark Knight Returns are there, but they're lacking the writing and execution to bring them to life, and it leaves both films as clunky imitations. The Dark Knight Returns is a classic for a reason, and as for the films it inspired, well, some things are better left unsaid. For now at least. If for any reason you've sat through this and haven't seen or read The Dark Knight Returns, first off, I appreciate it. This script started out as a discussion about The Dark Knight Rises, and before I knew it, one thing led to another. But more importantly, I encourage you to check out The Dark Knight Returns for yourself. A Cliff Notes plot summary doesn't really do the story justice. As you've probably noticed so far, the 2013 adaptations are incredibly faithful, bordering on a shot-for-shot remake in some places. Not only is the core story intact, but the stellar voice cast, the music, and the improved pacing all do a wonderful job at elevating the original story. I can't recommend this version enough, especially if you're not really a comic book reader, or if you just like good superhero films. And of course, I'd always recommend the original graphic novel. While I adore the 2013 adaptation, it does cut some plot lines, some of the politics, and a lot of the inner monologues that add more character depth. The graphic novel is the complete, unabridged version of the story, for better and for worse. It's a little dated in some places, but it's still worth a read today. There have been much better Batman stories since then, but The Dark Knight Returns is an important part of Batman's past. And honestly, it's a really important part of his future. BVS and Rises aren't the first to borrow from The Dark Knight Returns, and I can guarantee you they won't be the last. It's only a matter of time until we see it on the big screen again, whether it's with the next Batman or any of the ones after him.
Usually when a bomb beeps, it's a bad thing. Because they're about to explode.
When asked about the most influential superhero movies of all time, many often point to the Dark Knight Trilogy. Batman Begins paved the way for an era of darker, grounded superhero stories, while The Dark Knight pushed the boundaries of a typical superhero movie. As for The Dark Knight Rises, well, it depends on who you ask. For many, it's just as good as the other films. You can even see this in many review sites, where Rises is often rated quite highly. But for others, it's the worst of the trilogy, and for good reason.
I couldn't help but wonder, did I need a therapist after all?
Every film in the trilogy has its flaws, and even though Rises has its strong points, it can be hard to look past many of its issues. And I say that as someone who used to love this movie. I'm not exaggerating either. I love this movie so much, I dedicated my college admissions essay to it. And while it's definitely as corny as it sounds, I actually got accepted by that very essay. Not many people have tangible, financial proof that Batman changed their life. And if anyone has Nolan's contact info, let me know, because I got a hell of an invoice for him. But all jokes aside, I used to adore this movie, and that adoration must have come from somewhere. The Dark Knight Rises is one of the most emotionally resonant Batman films to date, and at times, this film was capable of matching, if not surpassing, every Batman movie that came before it. But as amazing as Rises can be, it's not always amazing, and your enjoyment of this movie will come down to how much it resonates with you, or how much it frustrates you. So before getting into the issues with Rises, it's important to be mindful about what those issues are. Rises always stood out to me as a film that gets a lot of critique, but truthfully, many issues with Rises were present in the other Batman films. Telling over showing, clumsy dialogue, messy third acts, you can see examples of all that across the trilogy. And if you're going to pick apart Rises for what it does wrong, then it's only fair to critique the others just as much. But while you could easily sit back and pick apart the trilogy for hours, I also think there's a point where discussion stops being meaningful and just becomes an exercise in self-indulgence. Instead, I think the more constructive thing to do is to highlight the most relevant flaws and explore how those flaws affect the film. And to start, I personally think the biggest issue with Rises comes down to a bloated script. There's a lot going on in The Dark Knight Rises, whether it's the numerous plot threads or the combination of new and returning characters. While many aspects are crucial to the story, others aren't so much, and screen time spent on things like Daggett, Foley, or the stock exchange all take up screen time that could have been used elsewhere. As for the other main issue, it'd be regarding the film's character writing. Christopher Nolan excels at writing themes and ideas, but generally struggles with characters, to the point where his characters feel less like people and more like extensions of a theme or idea. If you want an example, well,
I'm the protagonist of this operation.
And this isn't to say all of Nolan's character writing is weak, and you can see examples of stronger writing in other films, as well as the Batman trilogy itself. This film was interesting in that it has some of Nolan's best character writing to date, and at the same time, the same weak writing he's known for. While bloat and weak characters were seen in the other films to various degrees, they're magnified even more in Rises, and that makes it hard to appreciate the film's strong points. Rises has some of the highest highs in the trilogy, but many, many lows, and that roller coaster of quality isn't for everyone. As for the film itself, The Dark Knight Rises takes place 8 years after the events of The Dark Knight, and right away, we can see some issues. Now, the time skip in Rises is something I've touched on before, because it's partially an homage to The Dark Knight Returns. But to keep things on pace, the gist of the issues lie in how the time skip doesn't add much to the film, at least not to the extent you think it would. Nolan chose to use a time skip to show how the ending of The Dark Knight meant something, but instead of feeling like a narrative tool, the time skip feels like a narrative shortcut, where it's basically used to get the characters and story to where they need to be. The time skip is a good idea on paper, and you can see great examples in other Batman stories, but the way it's handled here is a bit underwhelming, and if anything, the time skip adds more negatives than positives. Because of the 8-year time skip, much of the first act is spent establishing the status quo, as well as establishing new characters and plot threads. The heavy exposition makes the first act feel slow, and not always in a good way. But the slower paced first act works in some areas, especially with regards to the Dark Knight himself. The Bruce Wayne we see in Rises is a shadow of his former self, and he's hung up his cape due to a combination of grief and the belief that Gotham no longer needs Batman. And in my opinion, this film's portrayal of Bruce is easily one of its strongest aspects. The Dark Knight Rises is first and foremost a Batman-centered movie, and while that sounds like a no-brainer given the title, Batman actually hasn't been a main focus for about 1.5 movies so far. Batman Begins is a fantastic origin story, but Bruce finishes most of his development by the end of the first act. And with The Dark Knight, Bruce doesn't develop as much, and he doesn't so much as change, but his initial beliefs and resolve are reinforced. Batman Begins asks the question of who is Batman, while The Dark Knight asks, can you endure what it takes to be Batman? As for The Dark Knight Rises, it raises one final question. Is there an end for Batman? Just like Batman Begins, this film was another examination of the man behind the mask, and much of this film was in service of Bruce answering that final question. And this makes for some of the most compelling scenes in the trilogy. More than any other film so far, this is the one where Bale gets to really shine as Bruce Wayne, and he goes above and beyond in capturing Bruce's sorrow, rage, and triumph. But having said that, Bruce himself is a bit of a double-edged sword, and it gets into a recurring issue with the trilogy: Nolan's portrayal of Batman. Nolan's Batman is defined by his anger and grief, and while that's a good starting point, there's always been more to Batman than that. Compassion, empathy, hope, heroism, traits like that are just as important as rage and trauma. And it's not like this version of Batman is devoid of those qualities. Nolan's Batman is an idealist at heart, and he has those brief moments where you can see empathy and compassion come through. But those qualities are often very understated, and the films never explore those traits as often as things like his trauma and sadness. And while that seems like a really minor thing to critique, minor things like that are what get people invested in a character. Batman is a superhero, and while things like backstory and character growth are very important, it's also the little things that get fans invested in a superhero. While I love the action and detective work of a good Batman story, I often think about many smaller moments as well, like a father giving advice to a son, or an adult comforting a child on the verge of death. And the reason I keep bringing up this issue is because more than any other film in the trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises relies on your investment in the character. Bruce Wayne's journey is the emotional core of this movie, and if you aren't invested in this journey, a huge aspect of this film won't resonate with you. And even though the trilogy gives you many reasons to be invested, I'm not sure if it's enough, especially when you look at what this version of Batman lacks. For example, Nolan's Batman only has a handful of relationships, and because of that, we don't get to see many sides to his personality. The most we get to seeing a unique side of Bruce is with Rachel, and like, come on, she's no Andrea Beaumont. And in addition, this Batman is far from the world's greatest detective, as most of his detective skills involve punching things into a computer and letting the computer do all the work. Batman's detective skills are there, but again, they're very understated compared to his other qualities. And to top it all off, not only was Batman sidelined for an entire movie, but his most heroic qualities were either understated or effectively null and void by the time of Rises. I firmly believe the ending of The Dark Knight was one of Bruce's shining moments, and it's in that moment where he shows an indomitable will and the resolve to keep fighting no matter how hard it gets. Then by the time of Rises, you find out that he in fact did not have the resolve to keep going. And even though Bruce goes through a distinct arc across the trilogy, the arc in question is essentially various permutations of being sad and angry. I know it's a massive oversimplification, but it's not entirely inaccurate either. But the point I'm trying to make is that this Batman is missing a lot that could really add to his character. More characterization is never a bad thing, and that goes a long way to getting an audience invested. And I say all this as someone who, to reiterate, still likes this version of Batman in spite of his issues. For me, there's still enough there that makes him a compelling character, and because I'm invested in this Batman, many parts of Rises still resonate with me. But like always, that is just one person's perspective, and your investment in Nolan's Batman will come down to your preferences. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight aren't as reliant on your investment in Bruce Wayne, and even if you were neutral or indifferent to the character, there was almost always something else to keep you engaged. But with Rises, neutrality and indifference might not be enough. A character study doesn't mean anything if you aren't at least a little invested, and while there's more to Rises than just Bruce Wayne, it's still a central aspect of this film. But in any case, most of the first act revolves around establishing various characters and plot threads, which includes everything from Bruce's mental state to the cogs of Bane's master plan. Everything culminates in Bruce coming out of retirement and his first encounter with Bane, and for all this movie's faults, the first Bane fight is one of the best in the trilogy. While the choreography and camera work is still average at best, there's something haunting about the lack of music and the sounds of Bruce getting picked apart piece by piece. It's easily the best fight in the movie, and a contender for the best in the Nolan trilogy. But of course, the battle doesn't end well for Bruce, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. Bruce's defeat signals the beginning of the second act, and with it, the full reveal of Bane's master plan. Bane reveals that like Ra's al Ghul before him, he intends to destroy Gotham once and for all. A nuclear bomb is set to go off in 5 months, and even though Bane explains that Gotham has a chance to stop the explosion, it's ultimately a lie designed to give the citizens of Gotham the illusion of hope. And the second act is a good branching point to discuss everyone's favorite Harley Quinn character, Bane. All in all, Bane is a pretty good villain. Bruce hasn't had a physical equal since Ra's, and Bane functions as both a physical superior and an intellectual equal. That said, there are a handful of issues with Bane, one of which we'll come back to later. As for another issue,
I'm sorry, we are out of apple pie.
That's Bane.
Is that with a Coke to drink?
I feel like Ryan is like a Sean Connery and the mouth was definitely Bane.
Could you repeat yourself?
but besides his dorky voice, the more pressing issue with Bane lies in his writing, or specifically, the way his plans play out. Bane is the main driving force of the film, and as such, it's where you can see a lot of the issues with the film's writing. But to summarize, Bane's plans are as follows. Kidnap nuclear physicist Dr. Pavel, have a member of Bruce Wayne's board, John Daggett, use Selina Kyle to steal Bruce Wayne's fingerprints, use said fingerprints to drain Bruce of his money, defeat Batman and steal his equipment, turn Bruce's fusion reactor into a nuclear bomb, reveal the bomb to Gotham to throw the city into a frenzy, and hold the city hostage while the core slowly decays over 5 months, trap Gotham's police force underground, sit back and watch Gotham slowly tear itself apart, then lastly, kill Batman. And when you look at Bane's entire plan, it comes off as really complicated, and for no particular reason either. Parts of Bane's plan don't serve much of a purpose, and even if they do, it's equal parts convoluted and contrived. For example, the entire subplot with the stock exchange boils down to Bane ordering Daggett ordering Selina to steal Bruce's prints. It's debatable whether this is part of Bane's plan, or more of Daggett's plan, but from a story standpoint, this subplot doesn't really matter. Bruce is honestly barely inconvenienced by being broke, and if you cut this entire storyline, the core film doesn't change very much. If the film really wanted to include this subplot, why not just cut out Daggett and have Selina report directly to Bane? Or better yet, why not use another character, especially one who serves as a love interest and a member of the Wayne board? It just seems pointless to add more characters to this subplot, especially when it barely matters in the first place. But in any case, I hope I made my point clear. If Bane's plan was limited to defeating Bruce, turning the reactor into a bomb, and holding Gotham hostage, most of the film plays out in a similar way. Things like the stock exchange and trapping the cops underground are really superfluous additions, and if anything, their inclusion just weakens the whole script. And there's nothing wrong with complicated plot threads either. I like a complicated plot as much as the next person. After all, many of the Joker's plans were just as complicated as Bane's, and they were often a mix of predictions, gambles, and improvisation. If you told me the Joker was high on spice and could see the future, I'd believe you, because a lot of his plans only work when everything plays out in a very specific manner. My man had to basically play 5D chess and make insane reads, and it makes the Dark Knight feel really contrived at times. But as complicated and convoluted as the Joker's schemes are, they're easy to look past because they add to the story of the film. While the Joker is obviously very intelligent, his more defining quality is his chaotic nature, and much of the Dark Knight revolves around Bruce, Gordon, and Dent trying to keep up with the Joker. The Joker's antics add tension and chaos to the story, and because of that, it's easy to forgive any narrative missteps. But in the case of Bane, his complicated plans don't add much to the overall story. In essence, a lot of Bane's plans amount to complex methods to achieve simple goals, and while parts of his plans make perfect sense, others are borderline nonsensical. Complicated writing isn't a shortcut for intelligent writing, and instead of coming off as a carefully crafted, meticulous plan, Bane's plan just comes off as ridiculous, and it makes Bane come off as ridiculous as well, assuming it's still Bane's plan and not someone else's. And in spite of all that, I still like Bane overall. He's on the exact line between being silly and threatening, but he also gets some of the rawest lines in the trilogy, and I do think his positives outweigh the negatives. As for the next part of the film itself, the second act of Rises is split between two halves, with one half centered on Bruce, and the other focused on the secondary characters. And while the second act is an improvement in terms of pacing, it also highlights an issue I alluded to earlier. Just like the first act, some of the best parts of the second act are when it's focused on Bruce. By this point, he's been broken physically and mentally, and he needs to find that inner fire to not only keep fighting, but find a reason to live. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it makes for some of the best scenes in the trilogy. Everything culminates in Bruce climbing out of a physical and emotional pit. And even though the metaphor is as subtle as a brick to the face, I can't help but love a scene that shows the triumph of the human spirit. However, Bruce's scenes are only one part of the film. While Bruce is fighting for his life, the other characters are scrambling to deal with Bane's takeover, and it's not always very engaging. As for Selina Kyle, let's start with the positives. Anne Hathaway does a solid job as Catwoman, and she brings just the right amount of sass and intelligence you'd expect from the character. But the issues with Selina lie less in Hathaway's performance and more with the writing. In Rises, Selina is more or less a hired hand, with her eventual goal being a device that would allow her to erase her identity and begin a new life. She's a former thief who wants to start over, and that's her main driving force throughout the film. But the problem is that Selina just isn't very relevant for most of the movie. She stops being relevant after the first act, as she doesn't have a personal stake in Bane's plan or the state of Gotham. She's more concerned with getting what she needs and getting out. And I recognize that's the intent behind her character, since she's meant to be a bystander who later redeems herself. But a side effect of this is that it makes Selina feel unnecessary, and if you cut her out and give her plot contributions to say, Tate or Blake, the film plays out in an identical way. And all of this leaves Selina as a forgettable addition to the film. Hathaway does a good job with the material she's given, but from a writing standpoint, Selina just doesn't have much going for her. She's not very involved in the main story, her relationship with Bruce is poorly developed, and while she does have a distinct character arc, there's only so much screen time to go around. Honestly, she feels designed for one purpose, which is something we'll get to later. And it's really frustrating because Selina isn't a bad character in theory. Many of her scenes are really good, and she's a breath of fresh air with regards to female characters in the trilogy. But the writing behind her doesn't do her justice, and she's yet another example of bloat within the film. And speaking of more relevant side characters, the second act also focuses on Detective John Blake, as he investigates the new state of Gotham. And cards on the table, I really hate this character. I admit most of this is fairly irrational, and if I'm being honest with myself, Blake isn't that bad of a character. If anything, he's one of the stronger characters in the film. But part of the reason I hate this character is because of what he represents in the broader mythos, the Robins. While the details and dynamic differ depending on the Robin in question, every Robin acts as both a unique character and an extension of Bruce's character. When written effectively, Robins can showcase different aspects of Bruce, like Bruce as a father figure, a mentor, or a failure. But Robin's perception in pop culture is a bit of a mixed bag. When most people think of Robin, they probably think of things like this.
Holy oleo. Holy astringent plum-like fruit. Holy contributing to the delinquency of minors.
Or this.
Rubber lips are immune to your charms.
And while general audiences in pop culture is one thing, it's another thing when studios, writers, and directors share this perception. To this day, most live-action Batman films seem deathly afraid of including a proper Robin, and there's no better example of this than John Blake. Blake is best described as the poor man's Bruce Wayne, as the two share similar ideals and goals. But that's about the most you can say about his personality, because other than his basic traits, he barely has a personality. He's less of a character, and more like an exposition bot and plot device. And in spite of what I just said, there are aspects to Blake I don't mind. I don't mind that he figures out Batman's identity because he sees part of himself in Bruce, and I don't mind how his character grows throughout the film. But every time I see this character, I just feel immensely disappointed. Blake is barely even Batman's sidekick, he's honestly just some guy, and I just wish there was more to this character beyond that. Blake is arguably the third most important character in the film, as he is the most involved in the story after Bruce and Bane, and to top it all off, he's this trilogy's version of Robin. And if you're going to include a Robin adjacent character and make them so important, at least have the courtesy to do the concept justice. And I'm not saying Blake should have donned spandex and start throwing hands, that's insane. But at the very least, I want a Robin character to embody the spirit of being Robin. A film like Rises is the perfect vehicle for a character like Robin, or to be more specific, Robin as an expression of Bruce Wayne's character. The film already establishes that Blake and Bruce have similar ideals and trauma, and you could do so much with that idea, like Bruce as a mentor figure, or Bruce learning to trust someone beyond his inner circle. More than anything, I just wish there was more to this version of Robin. As it stands, John Blake is such a nothing character, and he could have been so much more. But getting back to the rest of the movie, the third act begins around when Bruce returns to Gotham, and honestly, there isn't that much to say about it. The final act is split between side characters finishing their respective jobs, and the battle between Batman and Bane's forces, but none of it is very engaging to watch. The peanut gallery scenes aren't anything to write home about, and the final battle sequence is a huge visual clustercluck. Even the highlight of the battle, Batman's final showdown with Bane, is such a letdown compared to the earlier fight. Not only is the choreography somehow worse, but Batman's master plan boils down to punching Bane in the mouth. And I'm sorry, but that's lame as hell. I recognize that this Batman isn't as hyper-intelligent as other versions, but having the final battle be a glorified gimmick boss is a massive, massive disappointment, especially when the film did such a good job with their earlier fight. And the cherry on top is the final reveal of the film, which is that Miranda Tate was actually Talia al Ghul, a reveal that probably surprises nobody. And before getting into the negatives, I'll start off by saying I don't mind Talia for this film, at least in theory. In the years leading to this film's release, my friends and I would often talk about who the next main villain should be, and I was always an advocate for Talia al Ghul. Her character just fit in the Nolan trilogy so well, and the idea of her being a direct parallel to Bruce offered a lot of storytelling potential. So fast forward to the film's release, and the final result is less than stellar. The main issues with Talia are twofold. She's barely a character for most of the film, and even when she becomes a real character, it's already too late. There are hints to her true character, but she's really just a sorry excuse for a love interest for most of the film. I know the bar for being a love interest wasn't exactly high, but I didn't expect to see a worse love interest than Rachel of all characters. And it's really disappointing, because in theory, Talia has everything she needs to be a great villain. She has a really compelling motivation, and you know Marion Cotillard can do a great job if she's given better material. But the most Talia amounts to is a huge bait and switch. Talia al Ghul doesn't add to the story, and if anything, she actually weakens it. With the reveal that Talia is a real mastermind, everything about Bane becomes so underwhelming. Bane was just following orders, and the big imposing main villain winds up being another henchman. You'd think Nolan would have learned from history. I've been mentioning how large parts of this film can be trimmed, and Talia is the most egregious example. She either needed to be cut or retooled in a way that used her more effectively, and there's like a dozen ways to do so. The film could have revealed her true role earlier, given her stronger characterization, or even merged her character with Selina's. Surely anything's better than getting shoehorned in at the 11th hour, and then dying in one of the most embarrassing death scenes of all time. And following Talia's demise, the film moves into its final sequence. And for all of this movie's faults, I do think the ending is really strong. Batman as a character doesn't really have an end, and the idea of Batman dying, but Bruce Wayne living on is a good ending for this version of the character. But even though I like the ending of Rises always felt, for lack of a better term, reverse engineered. To me, it always felt as if Nolan and the team settled on the final act first, and wrote the film around that. I know that sounds weird, but think about it. What was the point of the cops being trapped underground? That entire plotline is really contrived, even for a comic book film. But as you see later on, the reason for this plotline is to give the final act a massive, climactic battle. Or at least, it was an attempt to do so. And on a similar note, what was the point of Bruce's energy reactor? It's a pretty strange plot point, and the other characters mention how stupid and dangerous it was in the first place. But as you see by the end, the reactor was meant to play a role in Bruce's sacrifice. And lastly, why include characters like Selena Kyle, John Blake, and Talia al Ghul? Not only do they have paper-thin characterization, but they're some of the biggest contributions to the film's bloat. And of course, the answer lies in the ending. Talia was meant to represent a potential future for Bruce, but it only ends up being a false hope. On the other hand, Selena was meant to show us that Bruce has moved on and found someone to share a future with. And lastly, everything about Blake, from his origin to his character arc, was in direct service of the ending. John Blake was tailor-made to be the next protector of Gotham and the successor to Batman's legacy. Now, I'm not saying the entire finale feels artificial, and I'd like to give Nolan and the team a bit more credit than that. And there's nothing wrong with writing something backwards either. God knows how many of my scripts start like that. But so many parts of the final act feel designed and predetermined, even if it came at the expense of the writing. The plot feels nonsensical at times because it was all needed for this exact ending, and all the characters were included because Bruce needed 2 love interests and a successor. And the really frustrating part is that if the film narrowed its focus just a little bit, there could have been something really amazing. For example, if you focused the film on just Talia and Bruce, you could write a really compelling story about shared trauma, love, and grief. Or, if you revise the film to focus on Bruce and Blake, you can make a story about Bruce becoming a mentor and learning what it means to create a lasting legacy. Some of the best Batman stories of all time are great examples of those very ideas, and I really wish Rises could stand alongside those stories. But with The Dark Knight Rises, Nolan and Warner Brothers tried to have their cake and eat it too, which resulted in this bloated mess of a film. And I want to express that as critical as I've been with this movie, I don't hate it. I think it's physically impossible for me to hate this movie no matter how much I try. You don't gamble your college admissions on something unless you really love it, and I still have many fond memories related to this movie. This was one of the first movies I went to a midnight premiere for, and I still remember getting into debates with friends about the Nolan Trilogy. I once argued that it was better than Lord of the Rings, and looking back, I can't believe how insane that sounds. But to make a long story shorter, I did genuinely love this movie at one point, and even though my perception of the film changed over time, make no mistake, I've had my gripes with Rises ever since day one. I always hated the time skip, I always hated John Blake, and so on and so forth. On some level, I always knew this movie was flawed, and I think it just took time for me to stop trying to outsmart the truth and just let it have its day. And in spite of all that, there are moments in the film that still resonate with me, almost as much as they did years ago. The Dark Knight Rises is far, far from unwatchable, and as time's gone on, it might have actually gotten better. DC films have been, let's say, very mixed in the years after Rises, and many Marvel films don't fare much better. But I shouldn't have to reiterate just how messy this film is. And even though I think the Bruce Wayne scenes are good, they're only one part of the film. And if you're someone who isn't invested in Bruce's journey, what else is there to be invested in? There are hints of a genuine masterpiece in Rises, but that's all there are. Hints. While my personal ranking of the trilogy used to be different at one point, my revised ranking should come as no surprise given the tone of this video. I personally think Rises is the weakest film in the Nolan trilogy, and while it does have some of the trilogy's best moments, it also has some of the worst. And if you're someone who genuinely loves this movie, I completely understand. It's always fine to enjoy something in spite of any flaws, and a movie like this one is no exception. And in spite of its many shortcomings, I appreciate that Rises tried to be an emotional, character-focused Batman film. Every Batman story will have some good parts and weak spots, and the most we can do is acknowledge those flaws and hope future stories can learn from past mistakes.